August 14, 1941. Smolensk, Eastern Front. The Russian summer sun is a relentless, suffocating weight, baking the dusty, shell-pocked earth. The air, thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and burnt cordite, shimmers above the column of stationary panzers. Inside the command tent, it's marginally cooler, but the atmosphere is charged with a tension far more suffocating than the heat. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, the revolutionary of mechanized warfare, stands hunched over a vast paper map that sprawls across a field table. His uniform, usually immaculate, shows the grime of weeks of relentless advance, a grinding, terrifyingly successful blitzkrieg that now, he realizes, is on the precipice of ruin. Guderian traces a line with a thick, calloused finger. The distance from his forward units to Moscow is barely 200 miles, a mere dash for his panzer groups in the initial euphoria of the campaign. Moscow, he mutters, the word tasting like a fading promise. He straightens, turning to the heavy-set, commanding figure of Generalfeldmarschall Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center. Bock's face is a study in grim determination. The sheer effort of pushing his men this far into the Soviet Union has etched deep lines around his eyes. Their headquarters buzzes with the low, constant drone of field phones and the sharp, decisive clicks of staff officers' heels. But in this corner, the two men are locked in a quiet, furious debate, a debate not with each other, but with a ghost operating hundreds of miles away in his Prussian fortress. Fedor, we have the Soviets broken, Guderian insists, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. The Smolensk pocket is almost sealed, their reserves are shattered, their command structure is in disarray. We must drive directly on the Soviet capital while they have nothing left to throw in our way. The weather is holding. Every day of this August sun is a gift we cannot afford to squander. We hit Moscow, we decapitate the beast, and the war is over by Christmas. Von Bock nods slowly, his gaze heavy. I agree entirely, Heinz. My reports to OKH are unambiguous. The Wehrmacht's primary operational goal is the destruction of the enemy's military capability and the swift capture of the political logistical hub. That hub is Moscow. Generaloberst Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, supports us. He understands the critical nature of the objective. But you know what Berlin says. He gestures toward a fresh, neatly typed situation report lying on the table, a document that carries the unmistakable, chilling authority of the Führer's direct command. The document confirms their worst fears. Adolf Hitler, intoxicated by the lightning successes of the opening weeks, the staggering capture of 500,000 prisoners, the vast territorial gains, had grown entirely overconfident, believing his intuition now superseded the operational plans of his professional military leadership. The Führer's Directive No. 34, recently issued, was a hammer blow to their strategy. Instead of driving northeast on Moscow, the powerful panzer groups of Army Group Center, Guderian's in particular, were to be diverted. Ukraine and Leningrad first, von Bock says, his voice flat with disbelief and frustration. He calls Moscow of no great importance. He says victory will come not from a psychological strike at the capital, but from seizing the economic resources, the coal fields, the factories, the grain of the south, and securing the northern flank at Leningrad. He seeks the slow strangulation of the Soviet Union through economics and the destruction of the residual armies, not the swift knockout punch. Guderian slams his hand on the map, the sound muffled by the thick paper. The diversion would delay the Moscow offensive by perhaps 6 critical weeks. 6 weeks that would take them out of the golden summer and into the perilous onset of the Russian autumn, the Rasputitsa. They knew, intuitively, the true enemy they were now fighting was not the Red Army, but the calendar itself. This was the moment of decision, the single pivot point of the entire campaign. To pause now was to invite the winter. Guderian looks up, his eyes holding a profound, terrifying certainty. We can't take Moscow if we wait, Fedor. We simply can't. The dust motes dance in the light shaft streaming through the tent flap, illuminating the line on the map that represented the 200 miles, the distance between victory and catastrophe. The dust motes dance in the light shaft streaming through the tent flap, illuminating the line on the map that represented the 200 miles, the distance between victory and catastrophe. Guderian's conviction hung heavy in the stifling air. We can't take Moscow if we wait, Fedor. We simply can't. He knew that tactical success, even the destruction of massive Soviet formations, was meaningless if it failed to achieve the strategic objective of collapsing the Soviet system before the elements intervened. The Blitzkrieg depended on speed, continuous momentum, and the enemy's inability to react. A pause, a 6-week detour, would give the Soviets precisely what they needed: time. Time to mobilize the vast untapped reserves behind the Urals, time to move factories, and time for General Winter to prepare his defense. Guderian immediately left the immediate front lines and flew back to his primary command post to draft a formal, powerful protest. His staff officers watched him work, his pen scratching furiously on the official memorandum paper, detailing the operational realities in stark, uncompromising terms. He wasn't alone in this desperate plea. Back in the cold, meticulous environment of OKH headquarters in East Prussia, Generaloberst Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, was already fighting the same internal battle, facing the Führer directly. Halder was a precise, methodical man, obsessed with logistics and the mathematical certainty of warfare. For him, the pivot away from Moscow was not just a strategic error, but a logistical impossibility. Halder's daily war diaries from this period are saturated with entries reflecting his mounting desperation. August 18, 1941. The Army staff holds firm to the view that the sole goal of Army Group Center must be to capture Moscow before the onset of the weather. The capture of Moscow would destroy the spiritual and organizational center of the Soviet resistance. But every argument Halder presented to Hitler was met with either icy dismissal or a furious, messianic counterargument. Hitler's mind was now set on economic targets: the Donetsk Basin, the wheat of the Black Earth region, the factories around Leningrad. These were the prizes he saw as the material keys to winning the war. He believed the Soviets were already on the verge of total collapse, and therefore political and strategic objectives were less vital than the immediate seizure of resources necessary to wage a long war against Britain and the eventual conquest of the rest of Europe. This moment in mid-August was the critical psychological shift for the Führer. Having initially deferred to his generals on military strategy, Hitler now believed himself infallible. The victories in Poland, France, and the stunning advances in Russia had confirmed his self-image as a military genius far superior to the conventional, methodical planning of his general staff. He saw his generals as timid, overly cautious, and unable to grasp the vast, revolutionary scale of his vision. This overconfidence bred contempt for the warnings. The generals spoke of logistics. Hitler spoke of destiny. The generals spoke of the calendar. Hitler spoke of racial superiority and the imminent collapse of Bolshevism. The official directive that followed Halder's protests confirmed the diversion. Panzer Group 2, Guderian's main striking force, was to pivot south to assist Army Group South in the vast encirclement battle around Kiev, while significant forces from Army Group Center were detached north toward Leningrad. Guderian, receiving the formal order at his headquarters, felt a profound, chilling despair. He knew that even if they destroyed the Soviet armies in the south, which they would brilliantly, the resulting gain would be at the expense of the one non-renewable resource they possessed: time. He knew he had just been ordered to win a decisive victory in the wrong place at the wrong time, guaranteeing a strategic loss. The road to Moscow was about to be abandoned for the promise of Ukrainian grain, and Guderian stared at the map, seeing not a future victory, but the growing shadow of a Russian winter he knew they were utterly unprepared to face. Guderian stared at the map, seeing not a future victory, but the growing shadow of a Russian winter he knew they were utterly unprepared to face. Nevertheless, he was a soldier, bound by discipline, and the orders from the Führer were absolute. On August 24, 1941, the gears began to grind, not toward Moscow, but south. Panzer Group 2, the spearhead designed for the capital, turned its armored might into the scorching steppes of Ukraine. The immediate result was another staggering, textbook victory of German operational art. The objective was the massive Soviet concentration around Kiev, held by Marshal Semyon Budyonny's southwestern front. Guderian's tanks, combined with forces under General Feldmarschall Ewald von Kleist from Army Group South, executed a devastating pincer movement. The operation was a logistical nightmare for the advancing Germans. The roads were poor, supplies were stretched over vast, insecure distances, and the heat took a heavy toll on men and machines alike. Yet, the tactical momentum was irresistible. The German forces linked up far to the east of Kiev, trapping an immense force of Red Army troops against the Dnieper River. The climax came in late September. The resulting Battle of Kiev was an unparalleled catastrophe for the Soviet Union. When the smoke cleared, over 665,000 Soviet prisoners had been captured, the largest single encirclement in military history. The economic targets Hitler craved were now in German hands, and the military power of the Southwestern Front was utterly annihilated. For Hitler, the success validated his judgment completely. His military intuition, he believed, had delivered a strategic victory that the methodical, plotting generals of the OKH could never have achieved by simply chasing a political objective like Moscow. But for Guderian and his colleagues, the hollow victory echoed with dread. They had won a battle of unprecedented scale, but at the cost of the campaign's ultimate objective. As the last Soviet pockets were being mopped up, the calendar had clicked into late September. The 6 weeks Guderian had feared losing were gone, and then some. His panzer divisions were exhausted. The tanks, having traveled thousands of kilometers since June, desperately needed overhauls that could not be completed on the steppes. Their fuel and ammunition reserves were depleted, having been consumed in the vast secondary operation. Most crucially, the men were no longer wearing summer uniforms. The nights in Ukraine were already turning bitterly cold, a cruel harbinger of what lay just 200 miles to the north. Generaloberst Halder's diary became a litany of growing despair. He calculated the material price of the Kiev diversion. For continuous weeks of prime fighting, weather lost, critical tank and engine wear, and the strategic dispersal of forces that should have been concentrated for the final push. Halder knew that while the Wehrmacht had successfully destroyed the immediate Soviet military capacity, the Soviet political and industrial will had only been galvanized, not broken. Furthermore, the massive diversion had given the Soviets exactly the breathing room they needed to reinforce the approaches to their capital. The defensive lines around Moscow, virtually non-existent in August, were now being heavily fortified by newly mobilized divisions and the fanaticism of the Moscow populace. The window of opportunity was not just closing, it was bolted shut. The orders came down to finally reorganize and prepare for the attack on Moscow, Operation Typhoon, but it was an offensive born not of confidence, but of the knowledge that they were already operating on borrowed time. The orders came down to finally reorganize and prepare for the attack on Moscow, Operation Typhoon, but it was an offensive born not of confidence, but of the knowledge that they were already operating on borrowed time. On October 2, 1941, the main forces of Army Group Center, newly reinforced but still weary from the southern detour, finally launched their drive toward the capital. Guderian's refitted but aging tanks moved northeast with the desperate speed of men trying to outrun a coming disaster. Initial successes were dramatic, mirroring the early days of the campaign. The Soviets, though warned, were still recovering from the Kiev disaster. In the massive Vyazma-Bryansk encirclement battles, the Wehrmacht delivered one last, shattering blow, capturing another 600,000 Soviet prisoners in a matter of weeks. The road to Moscow was essentially open, save for a few desperate Soviet reserve formations and the hastily organized militias. Berlin was ecstatic. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels declared that the Bolshevik beast was broken and that the final, decisive victory was imminent. But beneath the surface of this apparent triumph, the true enemy was already mobilizing. As Guderian's tank treads churned past the shattered villages of western Russia, the Rasputitsa, the infamous Russian mud season, began its grim work. In early October, the first persistent, cold rain started to fall. At first, it was a nuisance, slowing down supply columns. Within days, however, the ancient, unpaved Russian roads turned into impassable rivers of sucking, heavy mud. The soil, saturated and churned by thousands of tank treads and truck tires, became a quagmire capable of swallowing a 3-ton truckle. The high-performance German mechanized divisions, so reliant on paved roads for their lightning speed, were brought to a grinding, agonizing halt. Fuel tankers couldn't reach the forward Panzer groups, forcing them to pause for days at a time. Artillery pieces became marooned, their heavy wheels buried deep in the sludge. The infantry, exhausted and without warm clothing, struggled merely to keep pace, sinking knee-deep with every agonizing step. The morale of the troops, buoyed by the prospect of taking Moscow, plummeted as they struggled against a non-human, relentless foe. Generaloberst Halder's diaries again document the crisis with chilling precision. The advance measured in mere hundreds of meters per day, the logistical system collapsing, and the first casualties from exposure and frostbite beginning to appear. Guderian, riding forward to assess the situation near Tula, saw the stark reality with his own eyes. His officers reported vehicles overheating from the strain of fighting the mud, engines seizing up, and the simple difficulty of digging a defensive trench in the waterlogged ground. The delay imposed by the southward detour had cost them the crucial, dry autumn weeks. Now, they were paying the price. As the rains continued, the air temperature dropped precipitously, hovering just above freezing. The mud was slowly hardening into a treacherous, icy slush. Guderian realized that if they could not move quickly enough to seize Moscow before the hard frost arrived, bringing with it the real general winter, their forces would be frozen in place, exposed, and vulnerable to the Soviet counterattacks that were inevitably massing in their front. The strategic window was not just closed, it was being encased in ice. Guderian realized that if they could not move quickly enough to seize Moscow before the hard frost arrived, bringing with it the real general winter, their forces would be frozen in place, exposed, and vulnerable to the Soviet counterattacks that were inevitably massing in their front. The strategic window was not just closed, it was being encased in ice. By late October, the muddy, debilitating Rasputitsa gave way to the deep, penetrating cold that Guderian and his fellow generals had desperately sought to avoid. The temperature plummeted far below zero. The infamous Russian frost seized the land, turning the mud into concrete but bringing new, crippling problems for the unprepared German army. The fuel lines of the advanced German engines froze solid. The specialized lubricants and oils designed for temperate European climates turned thick and useless, meaning tanks and trucks could only start after being painstakingly heated with fires underneath the chassis, a process that took hours and drained valuable fuel. Ammunition became brittle, weapons jammed, and the basic operation of heavy machinery became an agonizing exercise in fighting the cold. The infantry suffered catastrophic losses from the elements. The German supply lines, already strained by the long advance and the earlier detours, failed to deliver the necessary winter gear. Soldiers were fighting in standard field gray uniforms, often without adequate gloves, boots, or heavy coats. Cases of severe frostbite spiked dramatically, becoming a debilitating threat on par with Soviet shellfire. Reports from the front lines described sentries freezing to death at their posts and men having to be evacuated due to gangrenous feet. The medical infrastructure, designed for bullet wounds, was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of cold weather injuries. Meanwhile, the Soviets, fighting on their home ground, were prepared. They had crucial reserves, including elite Siberian divisions trained for sub-zero warfare and fully equipped with quilted uniforms, telegrikas, and white camouflage. As the Wehrmacht stalled, immobilized by the elements just miles from the capital, the Soviets launched their fierce, localized counterattacks. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet forces under Marshal Georgy Zhukov unleashed a massive, coordinated counteroffensive, targeting the overextended German flanks. The effect was devastating. German troops, exhausted, freezing, and unable to maneuver their heavy vehicles effectively, were shattered and forced into a desperate, brutal retreat, a defensive war for which they were entirely unsuited. Guderian, who had warned Hitler back in August that this outcome was inevitable if they paused, was now fighting a losing battle to prevent the complete annihilation of his panzer groups. His warnings had been proven chillingly accurate. Moscow remained unconquered. The Wehrmacht had lost the campaign, not on the battlefield against the Red Army, but on the calendar against the Russian weather. The general who had told Hitler, "We can't take Moscow," had been proven tragically right, marking the point where the promise of Blitzkrieg died, and the fate of the Third Reich was sealed in a frozen, unforgiving landscape.